Greetings, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite you to join me on this battlefield map review of Ukrainian-Russian war as of June the 16th, 2025. I understand that the main focus and the main attention of the whole entire world is currently focused on the Israeli-Iranian war. But right now, I have to say that here in Ukraine, we have really hard and really powerful Russian aggression and Russian offensive actions. So right now, that's my duty to underline the main events which are going on here in Ukraine. And I really invite you to join viewing this battlefield map by liking this video, by commenting this below it, and subscribing to this YouTube channel. Let's start. First of all, it's worth starting with the announcement from the General Staff that yesterday the defense forces managed to strike a factory producing attack UAVs for the Russian Federation. Specifically, this refers to a production facility in Yelabuga. This is Tatarstan, the Republic of Tatarstan, where Russian versions of Shaheds or Gerans are produced. Well, the General Staff writes that supposedly the means of attack reached the target area. The results are still being clarified, but I would say this information is not entirely accurate, because in all those OSINT reports, in all those OSINT videos that can be seen in all those videos, to be precise, that OSINT analysts can study and observe the strike actually occurred nearby, right next to the workshop, right here in Tatarstan, near Yelabuga, in the parking lot next to the production workshop. But here, essentially, the most interesting detail is how exactly Ukraine attacked this facility. And moreover, not for the first time, I hope that in the future, similar attacks will result in much more successful strikes on enemy targets, because our drones are reaching there and dropping guided aerial bombs. In other words, these are essentially unmanned drones equipped with KABs. And we can take a look at how all of this appears in this kind of reconstruction, which was created by the Dnipro open source intelligence community. They recreated what it looks like. This is how our drone flew, dropped the KAB, and as you can see, it missed slightly, landing next to the workshop on the parking lot near the Shahed UAV production facility. In the end, however, our OSINT analysts note that it was actually an A-22 Flying Fox UAV equipped with suspended FAB aerial bombs. It was flying in from the northwest side. And in fact, although it did not hit the highly complex target in the form of the workshop, this is not the first such attack to occur, where our drones dropped FABs. However, 13 workers from this workshop were injured and 1 person was killed. So these are undoubtedly such targets, military targets, the engineers and manufacturers of the Shahed drones themselves. Plus, we can take some satisfaction regarding the Shaheds that fiercely attacked us last night. We can also take some satisfaction from the fact that the Israelis struck targets in Iran. This is the city of Isfahan. According to reports, it was here in Isfahan that one of the Israeli airstrikes destroyed an entire workshop at one of the Iranian factories producing Shahed 136 and other UAVs at this location. So this is the positive side of what is happening. Although, of course, there is nothing positive about war, we still have to consider and work through its various aspects, so to speak. You know, honestly, I have this kind of dichotomy in my mind, in the sense that right now the world is racing at such a tremendous speed toward a third world war that we can't even imagine it. And while our Western partners somewhere out there are sitting and pondering something big, just look at what's happening in Lebanon, which is clearly unfriendly toward Israel. And when the Iranians launch missiles at Israel, just look at how people in Lebanon react. Someone is playing the saxophone. People are taking photos. It's just some kind of incongruous idol that shows what the world is really like and where it's heading. I'm telling you, it's rushing full speed toward World War III. Just take a look at this video. It's not audio here, but a man is playing the saxophone. At this time, visitors shoot rockets from the roofs of houses, missiles that seem to be heading for Haifa, Israeli Haifa. At the very moment when Iranian ballistic missiles are flying there, honestly, the whole world is just crap. It's exactly the same situation here in Ukraine, when Ukraine, according to President Zelensky, has committed not to strike at the energy facilities of the Russian Federation, while the Russians, on the contrary, are doing just that. And the last few days are an example of this. So in reality, it's pointless to look for justice in this world. It simply doesn't exist. That's why we need to somehow solve our problems on our own. Now, let's move on to some more problematic issues. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, friends, to subscribe to my Telegram channel. In the description of this video, you'll find a link to my Telegram community. In the same way, you can find a link, or simply by typing this address into the Telegram search bar, so to speak. At Pekhno News, you'll find my personal blog, Pekhno, which is, in fact, the main focus of my work. And for 2 years now, I have been working directly on it, just as I have been working on what is called the combat operations map. Essentially, from the very first days of the full-scale invasion, I have been managing this project. So I would be glad if you joined in. So friends, let's get back to the map. Let's talk about the Sumy region, what's happening here. First of all, it's worth mentioning that over the weekend, the president announced that the settlement of Andriivka has been liberated. And with this, he highlighted a series of counterattacks being carried out by our troops. So as I managed to find out, things here are not so simple. Even though the president is announcing the liberation of Andriivka, the situation is actually quite volatile. Let me put it very diplomatically. It's quite volatile, extremely unstable. There is no stable line of contact, and there are also certain nuances regarding Andriivka. But what are these nuances? That is not for public disclosure. I will just say cautiously, enemy infantry is still present in some places here. Similarly, for example, I know that in Yunakivka, over the past week, there has been active resistance against the enemy, and our forces have carried out counterattacks. But again, the situation is extremely unstable. And as of yesterday evening, basically, in the afternoon, I had information that up to half of Yunakivka was conditionally under enemy control. That is, in half of Yunakivka, there are definitely enemy forces, while in the other half, our troops are present. And the situation in the Sumy region is actually extremely volatile. Yes, it's worth mentioning that our troops are carrying out counter-assault operations. In some places, these operations are proving successful. But rushing ahead and talking about the liberation of this or that settlement would be somewhat premature at this point, because here we see all the hallmarks, so to speak, of modern drone warfare, just as we saw from the very beginning in the Kursk and Sumy regions, which were examples of the most advanced drone warfare, with active UAV operations on both sides, active electronic warfare from both sides, and active use of fiber optic drones by both sides. The goal of this entire process was to completely cut off logistics for both sides. Of course, without timely supplies and fuel deliveries, tanks, vehicles, and even artillery won't be able to move because they need to be towed somehow. Or if it's a self-propelled artillery unit, it also needs to be able to move. In other words, without fuel, vehicles won't move. Without mortar shells and mines, there will be no mortar fire. Without artillery shells and without the delivery of FPVs and drones, there will be no activity in this direction at all. So from the very beginning, the war here has been quite technological and drawn out, very focused and concentrated, specifically on the drone component, targeting each other's logistics. And that is exactly what we are witnessing right now. This is precisely what causes the instability of the front line, because wherever there are drones, there is quite a wide buffer zone along the line of contact. But the very fact that the enemy has indeed stalled recently in the Sumy region is undeniable, because if we look at the situation, say a week ago, and now a week ago, and now you can actually see, friends, that the enemy's advance has only happened in one location, in the Yunakivka direction. And even then, as I said before, the situation here changes quite sharply, frequently, and significantly. Let's move on to another, let's say, problematic issue that has recently surfaced in the information space. This concerns engineering and fortification structures. Regarding the Sumy region, look, folks, I haven't seen them with my own eyes, but I know they're here. And there's no need to say that, for example, the entire Kursk operation, which allowed for fortifications to be built in the Sumy region, was completely botched, neglected, and that nothing was done. No, that's not true. The real issue right now concerns all directions of the front. The issue is somewhat different. It's about the people who will be able to hold these engineering and fortification defense lines. Deep State did a fantastic job yesterday, actually, not just yesterday, but over the past week. Yesterday, they crowned all their work. They put an end to the manipulations regarding another area where, once again, we had these public information time bombs in the form of questions being raised about the engineering and fortification structures, where on the border between Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions, because the deep state team traveled along this line themselves on foot and by car, and saw firsthand how Ukraine is preparing to meet the enemy in the Dnipropetrovsk region, how everything is being organized. The deep state members took a ton of photos and videos. They posted exactly what the military allowed them to share. So the first and most important answer to the question, are fortifications being built on the administrative border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions? Yes. Are they already built? Yes. Are they being built according to the standards that are currently required by the demands of modern warfare? Yes, because in all these photos from deep state, we can see a large number of those means that are supposed to reinforce the defensive line and thus hold back the enemy. And delaying the enemy is directly proportional to the effectiveness of striking them as they attempt to overcome such obstacles. There are a large number of trenches and a large number of these anti-tank inflatable or concrete tetrahedrons, as they are more correctly and scientifically called. There is also a large amount of concertina wire. Here, for example, you can see it in the upper left corner. These are precisely the stretched rows of concertina wire combined. This is the key, and the detail combined with tetrahedrons. There should be as many of these types of engineering barriers as possible, and various combinations of them should be used in parallel with minefields. All of this is necessary, and all of it is being constructed on the border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. In addition, the bunkers are now no longer in open positions, not out in the open field, but have finally been moved underground, which has also been noted by deep state analysts who, I repeat, have personally walked through these bunkers. Everything is being constructed underground with various types of fortifications. The engineers and those responsible for reconstruction, as they claim, are aware of the problems with FPVs and drones, understand the demands of modern warfare, and take this into account during their work. That is, I don't want to say that, betrayal is completely ruled out. Obviously, there will still be some issues of betrayal somewhere, but our main problem is them. 3 concern the enemy, and 2 concern us. So the 3 problems regarding the enemy are their aviation, their number of FPV drones, and their enormous amount of infantry. Our 2 problems are the lack of sufficient infantry on our side and times issues with the supply of drones, which I believe there are ways to overcome. I have already talked about these ways more than once in my reviews. Right now, the supply of drones to our brigades is becoming more diversified. There are mechanisms that allow for decentralization and procurement. That is, the state purposefully allocates funds in the form of subsidies to the brigade's accounts, and the brigade commander independently decides which drones and in what quantities he needs. This is the first source. The second source is through the so-called E-points. When our effective units strike enemy targets and report them to higher headquarters, they receive points, which can then be exchanged for drones that our effective units use against the enemy. The third resource is when there is centralized procurement by the state through the Defense Procurement Agency. Currently, this is, again, being diversified into 3 different directions for these centralized procurements. So in reality, the state is doing a lot in this process. One thing must be understood: we need militarization. I prefer this word more. I believe it is more appropriate to use than mobilization, because without people, we won't be able to handle this war. This is our main task. There won't be a situation where robots fight instead of us. We have to enhance these robots. We have to control them, we have to manage them, and we have to become technically proficient in order to operate these robots. FPV drones, ground robots. And this is a requirement for the state, so that this process is streamlined, so that every person knows where to go, where to learn, how to learn, what to learn, and what role to take on in this process of confronting the enemy. But in reality, fortifications do exist, and they are being prepared. Directly on the first line of combat engagement, as noted by deep state analysts, and I'll translate this very loosely, so to speak, the so-called first line of combat engagement there, the engineering fortification work is handled by the combat brigades responsible for that sector. But it's important to emphasize, as the analysts write, that they need resources for this. On the second line, this work is handled by the regional military administrations and the state as a whole. Here, the process of preparing fortifications is in the hands of military engineers who build everything using the resources of the regional administrations and the state. The third line is already the most serious line of defense, located, so to speak, deep in the rear. Here, experienced military specialists, the State Special Transport Service, and our Support Forces Command are involved. They are working on it. They have significant resources for this. There is special responsibility here, and they are carrying out serious work on constructing fortifications. I already showed photos about 2 weeks ago of what our second line of defense looks like, located approximately 30 to 40 kilometers from the current line of combat engagement. In short, without going into detail, since it's clearly visible on satellite images, this second line stretches all the way from Kharkiv, passing through Izium, and reaches somewhere near the southern outskirts of Donetsk region. That's roughly the direction in which it's built, this second line of defense that Ukraine has been actively constructing since March of this year. As current practice shows, it's very good that we are preparing for the worst case scenarios, but as of today, thank God, the worst case scenario has not materialized yet. This includes the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the enemy is trying to push through in the Pokrovsk and South Pokrovsk directions, but here they are actually being stopped, and in some places even counterattacked by our soldiers. For now, we cannot speak of a full-fledged enemy presence on the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. It also appears that recently we have managed to somewhat slow down the enemy in the Kostyantynivka direction, although the situation here is already difficult as it is. The enemy, of course, is attacking in several locations. They are pressing on the right flank of the defense at Yablonivka. They are pressing from the area of Zoria and Romanivka onto the left flank of Yablonivka. In fact, in this context, Yablonivka is the key village for opening direct battles for Kostyantynivka. Let's put it that way. So fighting is ongoing in this direction. At the epicenter of attacks in the Chasiv Yar direction is the village of Stuposhki, and in the Kurdyumivka-Toretsk direction, the villages of Delivka, specifically both Delivka villages at once. These are, in fact, the main theaters of combat engagements in the Kostyantynivka direction. However, when it comes to any advances by the enemy, there's nothing of the sort to speak of. By the way, incidentally, these areas fall within the zone of responsibility of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, and I have information that thanks to those very same decentralized procurements I just mentioned, when the brigade commander receives funds from a state subsidy, which is about 25 million hryvnias per month, can decide what type and exactly which drones he needs to purchase with that money. So the 93rd Brigade, in fact, managed its funds perhaps better than anyone else within the framework of such direct subsidies from the state budget. And in fact, in its area of responsibility, there have been no enemy advances in this direction, and the brigade's effectiveness in using drones, FPV drones, has increased by about 700% over the past 6 months. That's what it means to put the right things in the right hands. And in fact, we have such exemplary units that should serve as a benchmark. The 93rd Brigade in particular is among them. South of Pokrovsk, the situation is actually very difficult for us right now in the Novopavlivka direction. And you can clearly observe this on the deep state map, although it reflects only very schematic, let's say, processes that are happening here. So first of all, this is the advance toward Komar. Secondly, this is the advance toward the settlement of Zaporizhia. Not the Zaporizhia that is the regional center, but Zaporizhia, the village in Donetsk region on the western outskirts of Donetsk region. Accordingly, these two salients that are formed here are actually an indication of what is happening on the front in terms of the looseness of events, the looseness of positions. That is, when positions are not dense, a large number of enemy infantry is able to get into our rear, able to advance through tree lines, ravines, gullies, and hollows. This is exactly what is happening here in the Novopavlivka direction. The enemy is constantly getting into our rear, both in the Lyman and Novopavlivka directions, through these kinds of corridors. And actually, this is the same thing I'm talking about regarding Sumy region, that these open source projects, maps nowadays, they don't reflect everything, the full spectrum of what's happening at the front, what's called the gray zone. That is, relatively speaking, right now, you could call half of the Novopavlivka direction a gray zone. In the same way, a lot of gray zones have now appeared in the Siversk direction, where the enemy has advanced towards Serebianka, where the enemy is moving in the Serebianska forestry, where the enemy has advanced along the Verkhnyo-Kamyanska direction, trying to push towards Siversk. By the way, the defenders in this direction, the soldiers of the National Guard Brigade, Rubish, report that the Russians have been using chemical weapons here for the third week in a row. They are using munitions distinguished by the extremely rapid spread of poisonous substances. And this substance, and as it is, our positions on the front line aren't very dense. but it also spreads instantly through the dugouts and low-lying areas, forcing smoking gun soldiers out of their positions. These are the kinds of methods the Russians are using here to seize positions in Lyman. But even here, where the situation is extremely difficult and practically inhuman, it can be said that the enemy is still being held back. However, even though there seems to be this relative stabilization, it comes at a very high and heavy price. The situation is extremely tense. At the end of last week, I said that perhaps this is the worst and most difficult situation in the past 1.5 to 2 years. It has not become any easier now, and this needs to be understood. And our troops, friends, need support from each and every one of us. So please support our defense forces. And now you can support this review of the battle map with your likes, comments, and subscriptions. All the best. Take care of yourselves. See you next time.